Hi, intro students. This is your Quiz 1 review. My voice is going to sound a little hoarse because of cold, so I apologize if that sounds odd at all, and I hope not to cough during this. But this is your Quiz 1 review as a video, as if I were doing it in person. You should have this slide presentation just as I'm viewing it here. Linked in our Google Classroom. I'm going to just kind of comb over and highlight a few things. These are our videos and artists that we looked at, and philosophers and artworks that are specifically ones that I want you to note. And then a little bit of reading. I took out some reading that I didn't cover very heavily in class. As part of our reviews, so just make a note of that. Then we'll go over a bit of our contextualizing art, ways of seeing chapters 1 through 3, contextualizing art part 2, modernity, paintings, problems, and then I've decided to go ahead and hold off on this last mark here, modernity and modernism via Greenberg and Rosenberg. I know I went over it in class, but I felt as though either it was a bit too lectured at you guys, and you guys seemed a bit glazed when I presented this stuff. So I really want to make sure you guys understand it, though, before we move on. So I'm not going to hold you to it for this quiz. So if you end up referencing this these ideas from this lecture, that's fine, but I'm not going to require it. And then I have a bit of links, specifically that definition of art that we've been honing on, especially as it relates to aboutness. And there's a few vocab terms I would familiarize yourself with. This should say ism with a dash, so it's as if it's the movement. So modernism, for example. And then this is a chart, basically a visualization of some of the ways that I've been talking about the process of art being made and going through in order to achieve that aboutness. And then just a refresher of how we talked in the first slide presentation on contextualizing art about the origins of art, and then this big shift, or I would say fracture, that happens around Marcel Duchamp's fountain in this work, and its impact on the work that you see today. So let me back up here and just talk again. We just recently watched the Paul Bloom TED Talk. He's the one who talks about the original, something having an origin, the kind of origins of pleasure, and how rooted that is in our values and our belief that something maybe is not just valuable, but that there was a specific kind of narrative or something attached to the origin of its making. Specifically, I'm interested, though, in how he defines belief, and belief being tied to pleasure, and the actual transformation that happens in your brain when you believe something. And so the classic example the example I keep bringing up over and over is the wine example. So patients, not patients, but I guess test subjects being fed the same exact wine, but being told one wine is more expensive than the other, doesn't just result in people thinking that the one that costs more tastes better. They actually experience it as better, and so they show in these test subjects that their brain sensors around pleasure light up, and so they actually are tasting that wine that they believe to be better as more pleasurable. Okay, so that's pretty huge when we think about connotations around whether or not we think something is good or not in terms of art. Now, Wim Delvoye is our artist who made Cloaca and the Pig Farm and a host of other works, but the thing that I really want you to hone in on is his attachment or his critique of status and value, where he's constantly juxtaposing different class assumptions. So a very cheap moped, for example, being given a carrying case that's very expensive, and so the carrying case being made of material that is much more expensive than the object it's holding, and the absurdity of that. His also interest in this kind of critique of capitalism around how we address real versus representation, and so he uses Cloaca as a way of creating a metaphor of sorts, but a pretty literal one, where he creates a machine that mimics the human digestive tract and then produces in a factory-like way, a reproductive way, human feces, and then he packages that. But he doesn't just package it in anything, he packages the feces in a branded way. So he creates these logos that say Cloaca, but they look like either, the Ford logo or Coca-Cola logo or something like that, and then sells people actual feces, right? And so his interest in that being a critique of how we, again, value or believe something is valuable based on its branding, its promotion, its context, all those kind of things really touch upon what we think of as art versus anything else. So art versus regular life, okay? Kerry James Marshall, we talked a lot about, specifically about his reclaiming of a symbol through an image. In his case, he creates paintings that are in form. They look like grand narrative paintings, so very large paintings that illustrate some type of narrative or story, and then inserts a deeply black figure into those paintings, specifically to elevate the representation, right, of the symbol of blackness. And so he's taking on or adopting a form like large, huge paintings and capitalizing on the fact that those already are accepted as powerful or important, and then taking something that is devalued in our culture, and elevating it. So the other thing he does is he really talks about demystifying art and reminding us that art is made of people or made by people. They're not divine necessarily. They're just, it's just a medium, right? It's just material on a surface, creating that representation. The Derek Matravers and the definition of art, I think the last two slides we'll talk about, but this is really honing in on aboutness, and some of the ideas we talked about, the process of anything becoming an artwork, right? So an artist making an artifact that then transforms and becomes something that is about something. Okay, and we'll hone in on that on the last couple slides here. So the Portrait of Ross is the placebo. It's the stack and pile of candy in the corner. I want you to remember that that is an artwork that doesn't finalize or complete itself unless you engage in it and actually actively participate by taking a piece of candy, and ideally eating that piece of candy. I think Torres wouldn't believe that that was a finished work until that happened. Now the key to his work is it's tricky because you have to dig into a larger body of his work and what he's trying to accomplish. And so by taking the candy from the pile, you're depleting that pile, and by depleting that pile and then maybe returning to the gallery and seeing that that pile has been replenished, then you have possibly a thought of understanding the maintenance that goes into replenishing that pile. And if you go there and you're willing to go there, you might be thinking about maintenance in general. Like how are things maintained? And for him, Portrait of Ross is a representation of his dead lover. Ross died from AIDS, HIV/AIDS, and later actually Torres does as well, sadly. But the Portrait of Ross, the pile of candy, is supposed to represent the weight of his dead lover, and then taking that a step farther and thinking really about maintenance and its relationship to institutions. For one, the institution, the museum, right? The artwork relies on that institution for it to thrive and continue, as citizens rely on the institution of their government and their governing bodies in order to help sustain their lives. And I would say that he was portraying that breakdown with the Portrait of Ross, and saying that there was a taking that was happening, but a very invisible or absent replenishment. All right, so Vic Muniz, we talked about his representation and the material carrying meaning. Think about the image I showed of the cloud, or the drawing of the cloud in the sky, and really ask yourself, is that drawing a cloud, or is it a picture of a cloud? And can it be both? Okay. Gabriel Roscoe is our empty shoebox, and Ben Lewis is the person who is critiquing that artwork based on, the institutions of art, elevating works that aren't very meaningful or don't have much to say. And I would say that what we discussed was, well, Ben Lewis isn't necessarily wrong, but maybe what he's trying to say is that art is too self-centered, or the art world is too self-centered, and that artworks are becoming too much about art or about themselves, and not necessarily more meaningful things for people in the world. And that might be a failing of sorts. Framing the Artist by Temporary Services was the PDF, and there's a video here too. I want you to think of your own example of sorts that you can come up with, that you maybe have seen, in terms of how artists are represented in media, and whether or not those representations are accurate or clear or trustworthy. Those are the things that I think are pulled from that reading, because we make a ton of assumptions as to who artists are and what they do and what they're trying to accomplish. Now, one thing I noticed here is that there's I'm going to go to a link here, but there's a link or a bullet point here for Orlan. I'm going to skip that, so don't worry about that. I'll take that out, unfortunately, and I think that just was a symptom, a lack of time. But the main thing I want you to hone in on this lecture and really pay attention to is the idea of beauty becoming a criteria that is no longer useful for defining what art is. And that has everything to do with the fact that humans can't universally agree as to what defines beauty. And so we really want to break down and think about judgment. So when we say something is art, and therefore it's art because it's beautiful, we really are making a judgment, and a subjective judgment, because what I might think of as beauty and beautiful is not necessarily what you would. And so it fails for us in helping us understand how we define art. And so we need to set it aside. We need to break with this idea of beauty as something that helps us understand and define what art is. Okay, that was a big one. Duchamp, obviously, we've covered him a lot and talked about him, but this idea of context, you know, the fact that we create and generate institutions that house and present art to us, that's a invention, a human invention, and something that is worth acknowledging. You know, that we are, here, let me go down here, we're in this kind of break with beauty called modernism, which we've really been honing in on over the last couple, I guess, 8 weeks. But then thinking about this kind of identity crisis that we're going to get into with the relationship of photography and painting specifically, but how we think about real versus representation, or these different mediums contradicting or conflicting with one another, or pushing one another in different directions. Now, this really again comes back to this, is this object art conversation and this aboutness, right? So currently it's acting most appropriately as a coffee cup, but if I place it on a pedestal in an art gallery and I'm an artist, right, I'm putting forward this. I'm saying the coffee cup has gone through a process and has now become about coffee mug, right? Because I'm an artist and I'm putting forward this coffee cup as a candidate for your appreciation. And as this becomes about, or the nature of the mass consumed objects, or whatever, this aboutness starts to reveal new subjects to us that we don't come to or think about, or we don't imagine that the coffee cup in its existence here as coffee cup is asking us to think of those things. Okay? Where art is specifically doing that. All right? And so all art does this, therefore anything can become art, but not everything is art. If everything is art, then we wouldn't be able to function, right? We come into that idea of having to be conflicted by everything we come across, and questioning everything's aboutness, right? Now, I tie this into it being a deeply human thing to do, to represent. We talked about the Shavat caves, and this idea of really needing representation and needing art in order to create that aboutness that humans on a deeper level require in order to help us make sense of the world. All right? Now, if I come back here and go to ways of seeing, I'm not going to jump through this, but I do want you to think about how John Berger in chapters 1 through 3 defines and thinks about these terms like representation, presences, male gaze. Go through and review those, okay? I don't think I need to do that in length here, but I want you to pay attention to those. In contextualizing art part 2, thinking about isms, and thinking about Courbet and his idea of realism might help. Let me jump to this slide presentation, make sure, when I said here, I'd like you to stop at slide 18. Let me do that here. So, you know, this really comes down to why should you spend your time viewing art? And then gets us into this conversation of what do artists do? Right? And we talked about a few hard examples. Now, I had you stop at Courbet and not go into this topic around defining culture just yet. We'll get into that. So maybe do me a favor and skip this 19 through 27. But we do talk about Rauschenberg a bit, but I'm not going to harp on this because this is going to come into more play at the second half of our semester, okay? So stop at slide 18. Think about isms and why they exist, and the example I give here of realism, right? The realist movement might be a nice way of really rounding out understanding what isms are about. They're often in response to a previous ism or a previous train of thought for what art should be doing. And so the general idea here is that these isms are pushing a movement of art that has a similar interest in something, right? In this case, the realist movement was pushing back against romanticism and what people were driven to, how people were driven to make paintings that fulfilled what romanticism was doing. And Colbert was in direct conflict with that and felt like painting needed to be doing this other thing, in his opinion, documenting and demonstrating the world as it is. Okay? Now, modernity, the three characteristics that I really want you to harp on or pay attention to most significantly, right, is this belief in technology and not craft. Craft being like the skill or the skillfulness of how something's made. Of human perfectibility, not original sin. So this kind of distancing from fate or a belief structure, often rooted in a belief of God, where humans can kind of do it themselves. And then a ceaseless consumption of things and the images of things. Okay, so that mass production idea. And this most visible sign of this future is the car, right? But we talk a lot about the speed and velocity at which we start to see significant transformations in our world around that turn of the century. A couple things to note, like, you know, the building of the Eiffel Tower, this is a good symbol for us. And then elevation, getting to a God's eye view or perspective by something human-made. And then the idea of witnessing or seeing ourselves and the fragility of ourselves, this coming from the initial views from space and the moon. These photographs, as I talked in class, spurred, you know, the environmental movement in order to help promote the safety and preservation of our planet. Now, we're here, we're almost there. In paintings problems, we've gone over this a ton. The main thing here is to see this split that happens. And the split coming from, you know, a general suspicion of institutions. This all around the context of World War I. So these masters of suspicion, here I'll go down here, right? Where prior to this, art, for example, especially painting, was in service of trying to, here, let me put it, was in favor of trying to eradicate the idea that these were made by humans, so almost the human hand and the brushstrokes and the way these are made are obliterated in service of the illusion that you're looking at the thing itself. So I'm looking at Mona Lisa as if I were looking through a window and she's sitting outside and there's the landscape behind her. Okay, and so the advent of different engineered techniques in order to give us that illusion of depth, of perspective, all those kind of things are at play. And we see a broader disillusionment with institutions like economic, spiritual, and psychological, all coming around World War I, and this kind of specific distrust in those institutions because the outcome has led us to this type of conflict. Therefore, it must not be working if that's the conflict, right? And so we got into the kind of advent of a type of capitalism that really relied on mechanized labor and human labor that's kind of detached from the objects of its own production, so the people producing things that they can't even afford on the salary that they're given and or payment that they're given for their labor, because that becoming really the only thing they have to offer is their labor in order to make money to pay off things they again can't afford, like housing, food, and anything beyond that. And so this kind of fracture that's happening, we see at the same time, advent of mechanized things over and over, and this being mechanical image making. Photography comes on the scene, and photography obviously changes how we perceive not just the idea of representation, but we start to question the subjectivity of painting, right? Whereas this is kind of showing the harsher truth, not that it can't be manipulated, but in general the harsher truth of what the world actually looks like, and represents it that way, where this becomes subjective, and the painter has some license to interpret what the world looks like. The crux here, though, is the thing that I really want you to pay attention to is how that leads to abstraction. Okay, and so painting goes through this identity crisis, wondering, okay, what can I do that nothing else can do? Or if photography is doing this whole thing that I thought I was doing, now what am I all about? And so we have a couple approaches here, and we talked a lot about the Van Gogh approach, right? The human-made. This is subjective and the real embrace of an emotional response. Not what Van Gogh sees, but how he sees it. This being experiential. Color, therefore, carries meaning. It's not accurate to the world. We can see the brushstrokes, the human choices that are being made, right? It's a expressionism, it's an emotional activity, right? Where the artist and his thoughts and experiences become more prominent. We get into, right, the abstraction, this would be the psychology, the dream state, right? Or the disillusionment, the idea of feeling fractured and lost from a religious or a spiritual institution. And then the other being the structuralist route. And the structuralist route being Cezanne for us is the artist that we use, but this being much more of a linguistic or a drawing attention to language and structure that painting communicates. So that gets us into what painting can be self-consciously linguistic, taking apart how it conveys and carries meaning. So this really becomes about painting. So it's acknowledging that it is a painting that is able to create illusion, and in this abstract way, it can the kind of logic is how stripped down can this become and still be able to reference and represent landscape, for instance, or something of that nature. Okay, and then we show a handful of other examples here, but I'd like you to go through and touch base on understanding abstraction, understanding that there were two types of abstraction that predominantly became a response to photography, and that's going to lead us into the second half, into our Jackson Pollock. Okay, so go ahead and skip this. I'll go ahead and cross this out so you don't accidentally or incidentally go over it. Just some vocab. The big ones here, you know, like we talked a lot about context and artistic process and form and content, movement, styles, ism, illusion of depth, right? All of those kind of things come into play in our conversations so far, and can be utilized in your responses to my questions. And this kind of graph always begins with an artist, right? An artist is putting and makes an artifact and is putting that forward. Now we have some categories that we've defined, but this is pretty broad. But the staples are painting, sculpture, photography, ceramics. Those are the big ones. An artist makes something that it puts forward as a candidate for appreciation, right? And it creates a link to the world. In this case, the art world. The art world is a construct, though, made up of those acting on behalf of the historical traditions of art, like galleries, museums, the academies. And then that, after it gets into the art world's processing through there, an audience comes to it and receives it, right? Interacts with it. This is the mediated experience between the artist, the artwork it's made, and the viewer. Okay, we have this space that we use for that. And that helps us also dialogue with whatever the work is trying to tell us. And then I already kind of covered this, but really thinking about that kind of fracture might help you with thinking about your essay questions. The fracture being, and thinking about how we need this aboutness, and that's something that carries on throughout, but the fracture happening with that disillusionment in the institutions that help translate or convey that meaning. All right, so I think that's about it for our review. If you have any questions, obviously don't hesitate to reach out and ask them, and we're gonna keep going ahead with our quiz 1 on the date that I've put on Google Classroom, and I look forward to any questions you have, and good luck studying.